Hi everyone, Sajid Amit here, and welcome to my review. A review that I'm very excited to bring to you because in this review I pit two very similar IEMs in some ways. So this is the Sennheiser IE900, a single dynamic driver IEM that came out in 2021. So this does seem like it came out eons ago, doesn't it? If you have been around the hobby for a bit of time, but this is only as old as 2021, so which is not that old. I wasn't one of the first people to buy this, of course. I was among the first to hear this, but I only recently bought it, and I've been pretty excited to bring this in, own it, and I listened to it a lot. The Z1R, of course, is by the Sony or the Sennheiser standard or by any standards. A lot of people call this the old man of the IEM hobby. Now, if you've been around this hobby, you know that IEMs get old pretty fast. They get stale pretty fast. A lot of IEMs are released with a huge bang with like 10,000 drivers, and then they get forgotten, relegated to the dustbin of history. That said, this is certainly not in the dustbin of history. This is, if anything, on the sort of Hall of Fame, because a lot of people who buy $5,000, $6,000 IEMs like a Ragnar, Jewel, Traley, what have you, will still own this because this is still a very special IEM. People have had fit issues with this, no fit issues with this, of course. But I'll still take you guys through, an overall assessment of how these two IEMs compare. They do have a similar price point. This comes in at $1,700 if I'm not mistaken. Now you can of course get discounts here and there, and used prices are quite low, quite a bit lower than 1,700. The i900 is around $1,500, but you can get discounts, and they're often on sale, and the secondary market is always there for you to the rescue if you don't want to spend as much money. So let's just jump into specs. So this has three drivers: one dynamic driver and two BA drivers. It has an aluminum coated diaphragm, an impedance of 40 ohms, a sensitivity of 103 decibels, and a 12 dynamic driver, a pretty large one. It's a pretty hefty bass reproducing IEM, as a lot of you will know, but I'll talk about tonality on that later. The i900 has a 7 driver. It's a single dynamic driver, and I have a thing, I think, for single DD drivers because one of my first IEMs was, included the likes of the A8000 from Final Audio. So I do have a soft spot, so to speak, for the IE900 and single dynamic drivers because they do have a coherence, a certain romantic sort of coherence, if I may use that expression, that I feel like a lot of multi-driver IEMs lack. Impedance is 16 ohms, so it's far easier to drive, and a sensitivity of 123 decibels. So 123 decibels versus 103 decibels. So and 16 ohms versus 40 ohms. So this is far easier to drive, far easier. So Sennheiser only does dynamic drivers, guys. Whether it's headphones or IEMs, they only do dynamic drivers. As does Sony. Sony hasn't really done a whole lot of headphones yet. They have one in the sort of Z1R series. They also have a famous one from yesteryears. But to jump into things along the lines of comfort, this IEM has also been notorious for not being comfortable, and I can see why. So this shell is super chunky. It's like the epitome of chunk. So that is perhaps why. And some people will say that this cable is not comfortable for them, because what often happens is that once you plug this into your ears, this doesn't loop as well as it should. Not because it doesn't have memory or not because it's not flexible, but it can slide out a bit from your ears, and then a lot of people don't like carrying the weight of this in their pretty little ears. So a lot of people will complain about the fit of this. But I'm one of the lucky ones that have had zero comfort issues wearing the Z1R. But I'll be remiss if I didn't mention that this is, of course, still the benchmark for comfort as far as I'm concerned, because this is just supremely comfortable. These are proper memory wires. You can adjust them, and that does help in ensuring that these don't pop out. They wouldn't pop out anyway, but this is superlative. The cable is of a similar quality in some ways, or similar feel rather, to the Z1R cables. Z1R cables are slightly different aesthetic and slightly thicker than the i900 cables. But so aesthetically, these cables are not going to win any prizes, guys. But they're fairly ergonomic, and that's what matters. And I feel like they're also an aesthetic match with the rest of the IEM. So if you see, if I coil this, it's not as difficult to coil, guys, which matters to me. And I think overall, because these are heavy IEMs, especially the Z1R, I wouldn't pair a Z1R with a cable that in itself is hefty, because that can drag the shells down and make long listening uncomfortable. Of course, I can do a better job of coiling this, but I'm sure you know how to coil things better than I do, so I'm going to leave this as it is. The IE900 has, you know, a decent cable, and it's pretty flexible, ergonomic, easy to uncoil and coil. So yeah, I have no issues whatsoever with the cable. I actually did buy aftermarket cables for both these guys. They both have MMCX connectors. However, I am not feeling the need to use aftermarket cables because I'm plenty satisfied with these lightweight ergonomic cables, and aesthetically I think they're a match. They might not look as pretty as braided cables that are, you know, have a copper aesthetic or silver aesthetic, the whole whiteness of copper, or, you know, the sort of color that, I'm sorry, the whiteness of silver and the sort of, you know, pinkish, you know, sort of aesthetic that a lot of copper cables have, or brownish aesthetic rather. I dig all that aesthetic stuff about cables, but these work for me fine, so I just want to put it out there. Ergonomics wise, this is the champ. This is not bad. Drivability wise, this is difficult to drive. This is easier to drive. And I want to say that this is also source picky, and I want to talk about sources later. To talk about sonic differences, guys, the sonic stuff is basically what I'm more comfortable dealing with. The spec stuff I'm sort of forced to do because apparently reviews are not complete if you don't talk about specs. Okay, mildly V-shaped IEMs in both cases. Elevated bass response in both cases. Slightly, well, I want to say slightly because it's slight to my ears. Slightly recessed mid-range in both cases. But not veiled, not distant sounding mids. The mid-range is crystal clean on both. There's no hint of masking or veil. Mid-range has always been the forte of Sennheiser if you've, you know, listened to Sennheiser's headphones, and it is no different here, because despite being V-shaped, despite the mid-range being slightly recessed, this has some of the best mid-range timbre I've heard in an IEM, and that includes the Treble. The mid-range of the Z1R I find accurate nonetheless. I do not find it dry. I do not find it lackluster. It's not as, let's say, realistic, perhaps, ever so slightly less realistic than the IE900 mid-range, but it's plenty decent, and it's not unnatural sounding. I do think that if you're pairing this with some cheap source like a FIO dongle, or perhaps even, you know, a random FIO DAP, although I do like the BTR7, by the way, so it's not a knock on FIO. But I feel like a lot of people will get into chi-fi sources and get like a certain dryness to this mid-range and then complain that this mid-range is dry. I do not think so. So I did not buy this the first time I heard this. I only bought it after I paired this with Sony's own flagship DAP digital audio player, the WM1ZM2. You can see this sort of gold aesthetic, which I love. It's a sort of a nice contrast with the Z1R. So after I heard this pairing, especially with the EQ boost, the Sony does EQ like a champion. It EQs so well with no loss of quality, clarity, volume. There's no fuzz with the EQ. It's just a phenomenal device with which you can EQ your IEMs. And I'm not a huge EQ person, but after I got my Sony DAP, I have been very excited about using the EQ feature. And I do EQ this. I do EQ this with my Sony DAP, and I bring the mid-range forward, so that's worth keeping in mind. Bass is great on both. When this came out, some people were saying this is the god of bass. This still holds a crown for being the god of bass. I would say that they have a very different take on bass. If you want something that's super hard-hitting, you won't be disappointed with either. They're both hard-hitting. They can both be, in some ways, a bass head IEM. But there's a reason why this is often recommended for bass heads, perhaps a little more so than this guy, and that's because this has a slightly more rumbly and impactful bass. This is still impactful, don't get me wrong. You could slam out on this. You could listen to all the slammy music in the world and never ever, you know, crave for more bass slam. You could be very happy with the bass on either. I know I am. In fact, the bass here is so good that in many ways it can make the Z1R redundant. But that said, I do want to mention that it is a more grunty, more growly, a deeper bass, or the sub bass does a lot of the work here. The sub bass is deeper here than I've ever heard. Honestly, like the sub bass depth here is just absolutely mind blowing. The bass also is very textured here. There's certain slowness to the bass of the Z1R that I think makes the bass realistic for a lot of people. I want to show you my EQ. This is my basic EQ for the Z1R of my Sony DAB. So I bring out the mid-range quite a bit, and I bring out the air quite a bit because I like a lot of air. This is not lacking in air, guys, and I'll talk about treble in a sec. But overall, for a lot of my IEMs on this particular DAB, I do find that bringing out the air works for me. So this has to do with adjusting the DAB's natural sound more than the Sony sound. This part of the frequency response, i.e. 16K. But 2K I bring out, again, this is not so much because the Sony DAB has a recessed mid-range presentation, but this guy has a recessed mid-range. And the bass here, I do like a little more bass. The Sony is fine for bass. It's wonderful for bass, but, I just feel like this balances out the over frequency response that, that becomes what you hear once you EQ. So, insanely fun bass. Nothing comes close under $2,000 for bass. They're both bass legends, honestly. To talk about treble, guys, I do think the treble is interesting because they both have fairly extended and airy treble. There's a slight amount of sibilance that I feel like some people have heard with this, and that does depend on fit. If it fits you well, you will not hear the sibilance, and I haven't. But of course, I've tried this in a different sort of ergonomic situation with a different sort of cable when this wasn't plugging into my ears as well, and in those cases, I did notice that this can have a slight bit of sibilance. But overall, if you like air frequency, they're both fantastic. They both have air for days. I do find the treble here to be slightly smoother. So the treble here is just very extended. It's like airy for days. But it's a very smooth presentation, and on most sources, this has been very well behaved in treble. I do want to say, guys, that if you're looking for something that is not source picky, perhaps you want to go for the IE900, because IE900, even off my humble FIO BTR7, has been phenomenal. Like, once I got this in, I was only using the IE900 with the BTR7 on my walks, and that was like true for days and weeks, and I could listen to nothing else. And I have a whole bunch of kilobuck, very expensive IEMs that I just stopped using because this was so amazing with this. Great treble presentation, very airy, very sparkly. It's overall a very exciting presentation. So if you want exciting presentations, I dare say that this might be more exciting than the Z1R. If you want, so the Z1R also has some technical chops perhaps that are worth mentioning. The Z1R sort of soundstage presentation is up there with like multi-kilobuck IEMs, even like the likes of Treble and Ragnar and all that, right? I do think the Treble is a little more holographic. The Treble $6,000, Ragnar and the rest are $4,000 plus. But at less than $2,000, you're not going to get anything that does staging so well. And again, it's a psychoacoustic effect. I mean, a lot of people say there's no soundstage in IEMs, but then again, there's no soundstage in speakers because, I mean, you can put two speakers next to each other and you get a smaller soundstage. And then if you put the speakers out very wide, you get a larger soundstage, which basically means you can mess around with soundstage with speakers, which basically means it's a psychoacoustic thing, and it might not be the same soundstage you get once if you hear the same performance live, if you know what I mean. So everything does a certain take, a certain replay and reproduction of soundstage. So as far as that goes, this has a wonderful take on soundstage. It's very deep, guys. It's very deep. Images are very tall. Images are very distinct. And I love that. Resolution-wise, I would say that they're both pretty close. It is possible the Sony has a ever so slightly better ability to resolve finer details, especially in treble, I've felt, and bass. But mid-range resolution, I do think, is very close, guys. It could be because this comes off as slightly more recessed, but this, I think, might just take it for mid-range resolution. But overall, for resolution, they're pretty close, I want to say. If I had to give it to one of these IEMs, I would give it to this one. Dynamics and slam, superlative on both fronts. Slammy, but this has this faster transient attack. It's a lighter sort of touch IEM in the sense that I do feel the transients move along quicker. So for speed, I would give it to this. Timbrely, again, very close. Sony does timbre great. Sony knows how to tune everything that they touch. I mean, the timbre on this DAP is just R2R level good. So Sony does know how to do timbre well, right? So this is no different. if you have something, you know, of a lower quality source-wise that's driving this, you might not perceive the same timbral accuracy that I do. But I have to say that on A being, the i900 does have slightly better timbre to me. And I love the timbre for this. So finally, which one do I like more? It's hard for me to say which one I like more. I actually think I like the i900 a bit more. And that's because it's just more handy. This is one of those IEMs I can wear to sleep. And that matters to me. I can put this in my ears and go to sleep. I can have this on for days. I never get bored of this. And it's just more drivable across all sources and just has better synergy. It's less synergy picky. So when I was driving this with my BTR7 and on my walks, I would never need to change tracks because this does well on every track, every genre on my BTR7 even. This, on the other hand, when I was driving this off my BTR7 on my walks, I was skipping tracks more because it wasn't as engaging without my EQ on vocal centric tracks, because without my EQ it was just a little less pleasing in the mid-range. So that's worth keeping in mind. This does have a more ornate presentation when it comes to its boxes and stuff, which is pretty famous. You can look up other reviews that I might link in the description if you want to see the whole unboxing for this, because the unboxing for this is a part of the experience of the IER-Z1R. They do make you feel like a king and all that, as some people, as the expression goes. But and of course there's a comfort issue here, but I do know that there are people who live and die by the Sony IER-Z1R and would not consider anything else. I'm very happy owning this. I definitely want to keep this just because of its bass and its soundstage and how it combines with my Sony DAB. But I might not have bought the Z1R if I had not owned the Sony DAB, because I do think they have great synergy with a little bit of EQ. This I would have bought regardless of what I owned. It's just a better IEM in the sense that it's a better all-rounder for genres, for sources, etc. So if I had to pick one, guys, I'm picking the i900. And that's that. So thank you for watching this video, guys. I hope this was useful. If you like my video, subscribe to my channel. If you like this particular video, give it a like. And I will see you in my next one. Bye-bye.